It's also going to revive the prosperity, the safety, the security of both the United States and Venezuela as well. Ed.
Following up on the oil part of this, the 30 to 50 million barrels of oil, how exactly is that going to work? You're getting it out of Venezuela into the United States?
Yes.
And then what?
That's exactly right. So as you know, Ed, as the president announced last night, this was the sanctioned oil that was basically just sitting in barrels, sitting on ships because of the effective quarantine of the United States of America. And the interim authorities have agreed to release that oil to the United States, so it will be arriving here at home very soon. The United States government has already begun marketing Venezuelan crude oil in the global marketplace for the benefit of the United States, engaged the world's leading commodity marketers, key banks to execute and provide financial support for these crude oil and crude product sales. All proceeds from the sale of Venezuelan crude oil and products will first settle in U.S.-controlled accounts at globally recognized banks to guarantee the legitimacy and integrity of the ultimate distribution of proceeds, and those funds will be dispersed for the benefit of the American people and the Venezuelan people at the discretion of the United States government.
It sounds like it requires a lot of private sector engagement and agreement from the oil industry and the banking industry. Do you have that yet?
There's a lot of private sector engagement that's happening right now. As you know, Secretary Wright, our energy secretary who's heading up this big project, is in Florida today meeting with some of these oil executives. And as we confirmed earlier, they will also be at the White House later this week. So they are absolutely eager to invest. They're eager about these opportunities. And Secretary Wright is a very knowledgeable guy when it comes to oil and energy, and he's the perfect man for the job.
Another corner of the world,
Sure.
real quick on Iran.
Go ahead.
So just to follow up on the oil, 30 to 50 million barrels is an initial tranche, if you will, and then what happens after that? What
I won't get ahead of the plans that the president and his team are currently speaking with the interim authorities about, but rest assured, there is a long-term plan here. Secretary Rubio and the entire team are working diligently on it, and this is just sort of the first action that you all are seeing. Ed.
Thanks, Karoline. So in order to get these oil companies to invest billions in Venezuela, how will the U.S. reassure that their workers will be safe in Venezuela? Could there be troops involved?
At this point in time, as you know, there are no troops on the ground in Venezuela. The president, of course, reserves the right to use the United States military if necessary. It's not something he wants to do. Diplomacy is always the first option. As you saw, he tried that with Nicolas Maduro, but unfortunately, he was an illegitimate dictator and an unserious person. And so President Trump authorized this law enforcement operation, and now Nicolas Maduro is sitting in a prison cell in New York. So certainly the president is going to do what's in the best interests of the American people, and that includes workers from our energy and oil industry as well.
With that meeting tomorrow, what is the message the president is going to give to the oil executives, and what does he want to hear?
Well, the meeting is on Friday, and it's just a meeting to discuss, obviously, the immense opportunity that is before these oil companies right now. Stephen.
Thank you, Karoline, and congratulations again.
Thank you.
The New Yorker had a story yesterday on the vice president, and it questioned his, quote, notable absence on Venezuela. And the sub-headline asked, was the vice president's exclusion from the operation in Venezuela an expression of his anti-interventionist ideology or political calculation? Would you be able to discuss the vice president's role in Venezuela policy?
I did see that report in the New Yorker, and quite frankly, I laughed out loud because it's very clear it's a fake report that's trying to sow distrust and division amongst the president and his team. Let me just be very clear. The vice president has been involved in all policy. He is the right-hand man of the president on all policy matters, including Venezuela policy. He was, of course, read in and deeply involved in this operation from the very beginning, and he was present on the night of the operation via secure communication at a different location as to not damage the operational secrecy of this mission that was so incredibly important to ensure that this mission could be carried out successfully without endangering our troops.
Karoline.
Sure.
The U.S. seized a tanker recently. Russia specifically asked the United States not to seize that tanker. Does this action risk a larger conflict with Russia?
I believe you're referring to the Bella 1 tanker that was seized this morning. The Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security, in coordination with the Department of War, did announce that seizure this morning for violations of U.S. sanctions. I've spoken about the enforcement of our sanctions policy at the podium prior to the new year, and this administration is going to fully enforce the sanction policy of the United States. The vessel this morning was seized in the North Atlantic pursuant to a warrant issued by a U.S. federal court after being tracked, and this was a Venezuelan shadow fleet vessel that has transported sanctioned oil, and the United States of America, under this president, is not going to tolerate that. I would also just add the vessel had a judicial seizure order, and the crew, so that means the crew is now subject to prosecution for any applicable violation of federal law, and they will be brought to the United States for such prosecution if necessary. Kelly.
Karoline, Happy New Year to you.
Thank you. You
I'd
too.
like to talk to you about a couple of things real quickly. The first question about the Venezuelan people. As you know, there's some 8 million Venezuelans here, some of them celebrating in the streets. There are Venezuelans on the ground who are concerned about their safety. What does the Trump administration, what is it doing to actually help people in Venezuela understand that they will be secure throughout this transition?
I think the fact that this president actually followed through on the long-held promise of the United States of America, the bipartisan promise to take down the illegitimate Maduro regime, should give assurance to the Venezuelan people and also Venezuelan Americans who fled this communist regime for a better life here at home, that this is a president who is serious about taking down illegitimate regimes and who is also serious about securing the security of the United States of America, including the Venezuelan American people. And I would just add that this is something that not just Republicans and President Trump have talked about for a very long time, but it is also something that Democrats have advocated for. In 2020, Chuck Schumer said that at the time, President Trump had not brought an end to the Maduro regime. The Maduro regime is more powerful today and more entrenched today than it was when the president began. Now you hear Chuck Schumer out there saying this is reckless. The American people and the Venezuelan people should be in fear. But this is something that Chuck Schumer has long advocated for. Senator Chris Van Hollen, same thing, had said that the United States is going to use its leverage and influence to push for negotiations to transition to the truly elected leader. This was under President Biden. We know Maduro and his cronies don't want to go quietly into the night. The U.S. needs to work to ratchet up the pressure. Now, Senator Holland says it's an illegal act of war to get rid of Nicolas Maduro. So the hypocrisy is really astounding here, and thank you for giving me an opportunity to point it out, Kayla. Sorry, go ahead. Yes.
So there are reports that the administration is demanding that Venezuela cut ties with China, Russia, Iran, and Cuba. Can you confirm?
I'm sorry?
Reports that the administration has essentially demanded that Venezuela cut ties with China, Russia, Iran, and Cuba. Can you confirm that?
Well, those alleged demands were made in a classified briefing by Secretary Rubio, and I know that there's a lot of leaks coming out of these classified briefings, so I'm not going to confirm or deny or get into what the Secretary has said in classified settings to members of Congress. But I think that the administration has made it quite clear to the interim authorities in Venezuela that this is the Western Hemisphere, and American dominance is going to continue under this president.
You've repeatedly at the podium called the current leadership in Venezuela interim leadership. There are Republicans and Democrats alike that say they want to see elections in Venezuela. The president has said it's too soon to do that right now, but is there a timeline for elections in Venezuela? Is he committed to seeing that this year, for example?
You just said the president has answered that question, so I will reiterate what the president has said a few times now to all of you, which is that it's too premature and too early to dictate a timetable for elections in Venezuela right now.
Karoline, you just talked to Jackie about diplomacy first, right? The Danes have repeatedly said they are willing to collaborate on all of the concerns that the president has, whether it's more troops, mineral rights, intelligence sharing. Why does the president feel he needs to own Greenland and not and put out the threat of military action when this could be done through diplomacy?
Well, who said diplomacy isn't taking place behind the scenes, Dasha? I mean, the president is interested in diplomacy. His national security team is as well. And of course, he's always willing to pick up the phone for everybody and hear out their concerns. But the president is the president of the United States of America, and he's always going to be very clear about what he views as being in our nation's best interest. Reagan.
Thanks, Caroline. I have a question for you on Venezuela, and then I'd love to ask you about Minnesota and Tim Walz.
Sure.
On Venezuela, I'm wondering, does the administration hope to start sending more Venezuelan migrants back home or have them self-deport if the situation in the country improves?
As far as I'm concerned, the policies of the Trump administration and the Department of Homeland Security have not changed. All those illegally present in the country are subject to deportation. And I would just like to add, how we got here. The president was very clear on the campaign to the American public, and it's one of the many reasons they resoundingly reelected him back to this office, that he was not only going to crush foreign drug cartels, but that he was not going to stand by and watch as the illegitimate Venezuelan regime was sending illegal criminals and gang members and rapists and murderers to our country, which happened to the tune of thousands under the previous administration and president. And so there could be nothing more America first than this operation that took place last week. And I would just remind all of you in this room that there were innocent Americans like Jocelyn Nungare who lost their lives at the hands of dangerous Venezuelan criminals who were sent here by the Maduro regime. And that has been the president's North Star and guiding principle throughout his entire policy since January 20th.
Tim Walz in Minnesota. Does the administration believe that Tim Walz potentially dropped out of the governor's race because he could be under criminal investigation?
I don't know if there's a criminal investigation. If there was, I wouldn't be able to comment on it from up here, to be honest with you. But I think Tim Walz probably dropped out of the race because he realizes he no longer has the support of the people of his own state, which is a remarkable downfall considering he was the #2 on the Democrat Party's ticket just about a year ago. When it comes to Minnesota, the fraud that we have seen, the wide scale of fraud is really remarkable. It's egregious. I would encourage every single journalist in this room to go to Minnesota and to cover it yourselves. As for the Trump administration, we have officials who have been on the ground almost every day. Secretary Noem was there yesterday.
We've just been watching White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt taking questions on Venezuela after the U.S. capture of Nicolas Maduro and now the seizure of 2 Venezuela-linked oil tankers. The press secretary started by addressing a question from our own Rachel Scott about conflicting accounts of who's in charge of Venezuela. President Trump has said the U.S. is running Venezuela now, while Venezuela's interim president has pushed back on that. Now Leavitt says the president's entire national security team is in close correspondence with the interim authorities in Venezuela, and that the U.S. has maximum leverage over the interim authorities there. Let's bring in senior Pentagon reporter Louis Martinez and retired Army General, former NATO Supreme Allied Commander General Wesley Clark for more. Louis, what are you learning about how these oil tanker seizures played out?
Well, Diane, what we are learning is that these were 2 very complex operations in 2 very different parts of the world. One in the North Atlantic, just south of Iceland, far west of the United Kingdom. That involved a tanker, an empty tanker that was attempted to be seized or boarded by the U.S. Coast Guard about 2 weeks ago. Since then, the U.S. Coast Guard has been trailing it. And what we saw was the flow of U.S. military assets into the United Kingdom, which is now acknowledging that they provided base assistance so for their bases to be used as launch points for the U.S. military to take the U.S. Coast Guard out to what is formerly called the Bella, but is now the Marinera, since it has become a Russian-flagged vessel, something which happened just in the last week while this vessel was fleeing from the U.S. Coast Guard. Meanwhile, further south in the Caribbean, we have another vessel. This one did carry oil from Venezuela. And what it was doing was had probably fled from Venezuela over the weekend. We saw the flow out of several ships that were carrying Venezuelan oil, almost at around the same time that the United States was carrying out the raid that captured Nicolas Maduro and his wife. And this raid, again, U.S. military personnel carrying an elite U.S. Coast Guard team to the vessel known as the MT Sofia, which the United States says was sanctioned and carrying Venezuelan oil. And so 2 highly complex operations all happening at the same time, and an indication that the administration is going to be pursuing these kinds of vessels in the future. We have Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth posting on X that any sanctioned vessel carrying Venezuelan oil anywhere in the world is going to be potentially an object of seizure by the United States. So lots going on with these 2 different operations, very similar, but very complex in terms of what's going on. And even more complexity here, Diane, Russia is involved with the one up there in the North Atlantic, because as that ship became Russian flagged, the Russian naval ships were sent at some point to try to assist or escort it. We are not aware yet how close those vessels were to what happened there today off the coast of Iceland, but it's highly significant that Russia is now involved, and even claiming that some of the crew aboard that ship, the Bella 1, are actually Russians, and that they want assurances from the United States that their safety will be guaranteed.
And General Clark, to that point, Russia is accusing the U.S. of violating maritime law with these tanker seizures. Were these operations lawful?
You know, I'm not a lawyer, so it's a little hard to address that. But yes, I mean, we are covered by our own interpretation of law. In a 1990 ruling, as I understand it, then Attorney General Bill Barr said that in matters like this, U.S. law takes priority over international law. And so that's the basis for U.S. authority. Now, there are obviously implications. There are people who would disagree with this. But let me just say from a national security aspect, I'm very pleased to see the United States has taken action in Venezuela like this. We'd like to get the Russians, the Cubans, the Iranians, and the Chinese out and put Americans back in there. I think it's part of our national security strategy to do this, and I think it's ongoing. So seizure of these tankers is part of that strategy.
And General Clark, as Louis mentioned, the Russian Foreign Ministry is also calling for the U.S. to ensure humane and dignified treatment of the Russian citizens on board that North Atlantic tanker. What happens now to the crew, the cargo, and the ships themselves?
I think the cargo will be brought back and sold on the market. The funds will go into the U.S. Treasury. They'll be probably marked and sequestered, and they'll be, as was said in the news conference earlier today, those funds will probably go back to Venezuela under some kind of a special program to make sure that they're used the right way and not feeding a corrupt government down there. But in terms of the people, I'm sure they'll be brought back, and unless there's some criminal charges against them, they'll be released. Now, if they're ordinary crewmen, there should be no issue. If it's the captain, if he has relationships with, let's say, Russian intelligence, if he's knowingly violating international law or U.S. law, then there could be criminal consequences.
And Louis, Secretary Rubio says Venezuela is asking for the oil seized from the tanker to be included in an apparent deal to give the U.S. millions of barrels of oil. What's the latest on that deal and the oil on that ship?
No, Diane, that is exactly right. And General Clark laid it out perfectly well, because this is exactly what Secretary Rubio laid out on Capitol Hill to reporters as he was on his way to brief members of the House about what happened in the Venezuela operation this past weekend. There is now a mechanism in place where the United States is going to control the transfer and sale and transport of Venezuelan oil onto international markets. And then the flow, the purchases, the funds from those purchases are going to be placed in American-controlled funds around the world, and then they're going to be held in reserve for use inside of Venezuela. So how does this happen? Well, what we heard from Secretary of State Rubio is that the United States exerts or has a maximum leverage right now, because what they're saying is that no oil can leave Venezuela by sea, because there is a quarantine in place by the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Coast Guard, and that so therefore there's no way these ships can leave Venezuela and export money or funds through their illicit oil program. So they're saying that that's the leverage that they have. And he also said that Venezuelan authorities with whom they've been dealing with, remember, these are the same officials from the Maduro regime. Nicolas Maduro and his wife are in New York awaiting some kind of court proceedings in the spring, but the officials who are in charge right now as the interim government of Venezuela apparently seem to be contacting the United States with some sort of approval about this, and especially with this new program. And so according to Secretary Rubio, he said that they want the oil that is aboard the vessel that was seized, the Sofia in the Caribbean, to be returned to Venezuela so that it can then be sold on the legal market, which is what the United States is now saying that they are controlling for Venezuelan oil.
And General Clark, Trump posted on social media today saying he doubts NATO would back the U.S. even if, quote, we really needed them. He's also talked a lot about acquiring Greenland by force if necessary, despite it being a territory of NATO ally Denmark. As a former NATO commander, what's your reaction to that?
Secretary Rubio said that military force is always an option. I know the administration wouldn't want to do that. I'm sure the men and women in command don't want to do that. And, the consequences really are unknowable. But there should be no problem in arranging any kind of reinforcement militarily for Greenland. Now, when it comes to economic exploitation of resources there, probably there are Danish restrictions or Greenland restrictions environmentally that might interfere with extracting certain rare earth minerals. Maybe that's at the heart of what the administration's concerned about. But I would hope that we would work all that out with Denmark and Greenland with the appropriate protections for the environment and securing the welfare of the inhabitants of Greenland and their prosperity in the process. It doesn't require a U.S. ownership. It just requires the right kind of agreements.
So, Louis, what are you watching for next here?
Well, we're going to see exactly whether there are going to be more actions like this, Diane. We know that there have been references to how some of these vessels that have been interdicted are under federal court warrants, that it wasn't just that they were under sanction, but that there were actual federal court warrants for some of these vessels. And so the question, which authorized the boardings by the Coast Guard. So I think one of the things that we have to see is exactly how many of these vessels are out there that are linked to the Venezuelan oil market, and potentially would they be targets in the future. We did get an indication of that on X because the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth posted that any kind of military action against these types of vessels can happen anywhere in the world.
All right, Louis Martinez, General Wesley Clark, thank you both.